Good morning and welcome to the Monday Call brought to you by NZ Funds. I'm Stefan Clark, Chief Client Officer at the firm, and to my left, I've got James Grigor, Investment Strategist. This morning, we have a very special guest entitled, the call's entitled From the Pentagon to New Zealand Hard Truths for Security Resilience. And we're joined by Tim Ewing-Jarvie, former strategic advisor to the Pentagon and a former NZ Army veteran, I guess, now, who had roles including as a sniper and reconnaissance platoon commander and Delta company commander. And you've had operational experience in Iraq, Afghanistan, and in the greater Middle East. What an incredible CV. Today, you are leading, Tim, Horizon Lab, which is a strategic advisory providing insight, intelligence, and decision support for companies navigating complex operating environments. Tim, thank you so much for joining us. It's really, really great to have you here. I thought to kick things off, it would be really good if you wouldn't mind telling us a little bit about your journey. Obviously, I summarized some of it there, but there's going to be a lot more within it, and how you today find yourself in Wellington after such an interesting background.
Yeah, thanks, gents. It's a pleasure to be here. I guess in some respects, my career path followed a fairly typical arc for New Zealanders. I joined more or less out of school as a rifleman, which is sort of I guess, an entry level position in the rank of private. Did about 2 or 3 years in there, and then commissioned as an officer for our officer cadet school in Wairau. Spent probably around about the first 10 years of my career down in Burnham with the 2nd 1st Battalion, which is an infantry unit down there. And then sort of through my travels and journeys, started getting exposed to a greater range of opportunities. As you move up in your career, you get exposure to more sort of initially operational and then strategic discussions. And what actually, the way this all came about was maybe more accident than design. I was actually over in Afghanistan when the security situation started deteriorating, and we withdrew a little bit earlier than planned because of that. But the border was shut back in New Zealand due to COVID, and it was quite challenging to get a quarantine room. So after a bit of a delay in the UAE, some good contacts looked after me back in New Zealand and arranged for me to parachute over into the US. So I ended up sort of accidentally doing a long adventure through the Beltway in centered around Washington DC, and landed ultimately in the Pentagon in their strategy division.
Wow. Okay. And then recently you've returned, I guess, back to New Zealand. Maybe not so recently, a few years ago. And tell us about Horizon Lab, and then would love to start exploring some of your thoughts on what's going on today.
Yeah, so I still feel like I just got home, but it's been a couple of years now. I After the end of my tour of duty in the States, I returned to do our Advanced Command and Staff College in Wellington, which is a really like world-class program where they take, I guess, middle to senior ranking defence personnel. So typically around the maybe 15-year mark for officers, put them through a year-long intensive master's program at Victoria, get them sort of thinking critically and creatively about the profession of arms, thinking in a more joined-up way across Army, Navy, Air Force, and the wider levers of national power. And from there, you'll typically move on into the organisation, or in my case, I felt that it was time to try some new challenges. So I had a brief foray into the broader public sector, which was a fantastic experience. But I think ultimately I found that, and maybe this will come up as the call progresses, you know, the relative peace and stability of the last 80 years have kind of built assumptions and mental models around how the world works and how we do business in it. And it means that increasingly, or it's more normalized for businesses to consult with, an economist to try to make sense of the dynamics that they're facing. And I work with some incredible economists, and I'm always like intellectually intimidated by the mental gymnastics that they can do. But I felt that there was a gap where, the geopolitical and geostrategic dynamics that were changing so fast were maybe not appropriately superimposed or integrated into the broader strategic decision processes that we were seeing. So Horizon Lab was kind of came from the genesis of that to suggest that we still need the economist view. We need financial analysts. We need deep market experts advising our private sector. Um, but there's probably an unmet need around making sure people understand the leading indicators in the geostrategic space, since the world that we operate in is changing so rapidly.
And you've recently published an article in the Herald with a colleague of yours and mentor, I believe. Would you mind sharing a little bit about, I guess, that as an idea and what you're trying to do with that article? And then we'll, I guess, launch into the substance of it.
Yeah, so that was a co-authored piece with Major General John Howard, who's recently retired. He is, like me, an infantry officer whose career took him into some interesting places overseas, and maybe less traditional career paths. Um, those included he was the inaugural Chief of Defence Intelligence in New Zealand, and then he was the Deputy Director of the US Defence Intelligence Agency. And you might have actually seen him. He was on Q&A with Jack Tame yesterday morning, and so he's sort of one of the few um, former defence executives who's taken more of a public profile. It's typically quite uncommon for retired defence executives to speak publicly on these matters. There's sort of a tradition, where you don't want to be seen to overstep or encroach into the realm of elected officials or I guess the standing defence establishment of the day. General John feels strongly that he still has some advice to offer, and I guess as is the tradition in these things, when you've had a person throughout your career who's been really good to you, taken an interest in your development, you do everything you can to support within the limits of sort of what's acceptable. So I was really pleased to be able to do that work with him, and it was really all about, I guess, provoking might be too strong a word, but stimulating a substantive national security discussion in the lead up to the election, because as I sort of said, the world's changing. I would argue not in sort of a cyclic manner, but a real fundamental structural way, and that means that there are so many emerging opportunities and challenges that we shouldn't be reactive to. We need to be forward leaning and proactive. We need to have harder discussions and maybe um, open up the marketplace of ideas. So we've got contestable policies around what national security and what our broader national strategy should look like, because it has typically been a fairly bipartisan issue, and there are strengths to that. But equally, we don't want to get stovepiped or stuck into perceiving that we have limited options or only one way of navigating the world, particularly given that the situation might have changed quite substantially.
You used the word in your article, rupture in the world order, and it's quite an evocative word, rupture. What is that?
Yeah, that's actually a quote from the Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney. He was previously governor of both the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England. So it comes with quite a bit of credibility, I guess, both in economic and statecraft terms. But he was speaking in the immediate context of acute trade tensions with the US. So his evidence was anchored, I guess, firstly in trade becoming more coercive and more openly political. And we're certainly seeing that in more tariffs, probe sanctions, unilateral economic pressure, including between traditional partners and allies. So that chips away at the older assumptions that deep trade interdependence would naturally moderate geopolitical behavior. Um, he also pointed out a broader pattern in how hard power is being deployed these days, and how international law is being respected or enforced. And so you could cite Russia's war in Eastern Europe, the US raid on Nicolas Maduro, the US Israeli war in Iran, the broader perception of paralysis at the United Nations, in the face of repeating international crises, or continuing Chinese, North Korean, and Iranian testing of international law. So I wouldn't necessarily say that the rules-based order has vanished overnight, and certainly some analysts have pushed back on that particular rupture language. But it's definitely under far greater structural strain than it was. So, the broader point is that we're moving away from that more neoliberal, trade centered, and institution heavy model that many of us grew up with, and back towards more of a realist or realpolitik environment where power, leverage, and coercion are far more prevalent.
When you mentioned Mark Carney, and I'm not sure how many people were like me and watched his speech in full, because it was quite a change from the norm of what you'd expect from someone like the Canadian Prime Minister. When someone like you that's right in the thick of analyzing the circumstance and some of the the article in the Herald recently is a good example. Do you listen to that and get alarmed? Do you get thank you, or is your reaction thank you, someone's finally talking about the realities of it, or do you think it's somewhat misplaced? Because I think it was a great speech, but sometimes great speeches aren't always full of the actual what's going on the ground, and I'd love to get your take on it.
Hmm. It definitely was a great speech, and I heard, I couldn't confirm, but I actually heard he wrote it himself, which feel like maybe lends a little bit more, um, more to the impressiveness of it. But
And you did it in French before English, which is also pretty
yeah,
impressive.
yeah, yeah,
Do you listen
just
to
making us all feel more inadequate.
yeah.
Um, Look, I guess so. The question there is, broadly, do I think it's accurate and reflective of what we see on the ground? Um, you know, I don't want to give too academic an answer, but you could talk about layers of analysis. I think, at the person to person level, the relationship between, let's say, um, junior to mid ranking officer in the Canadian military and the American military will be as strong as ever. In the same respect that, the Kiwis and Aussies when we were arguing over 501 deportees, those relationships don't change. So you certainly wouldn't say that there's a rupture in those important diplomatic, military, social, business to business connections that have been long standing. I think he's accurate though to describe the legal dimension here. So New Zealand, uh, we're a relatively isolated maritime trading nation, and we rely on an international rules-based order where everyone plays by a generic set of rules, and there are credible enforcement or escalation pathways, and that enables us to use, moral positioning and, I guess our soft power uh, to join diplomatic statements and normatively shape the way the world should be or we want it to be. Um, we're really just seeing that shift. So, that application of soft power just isn't having the same purchase the way it used to. When we see powers which were traditionally, I guess you could say, rising powers or challenges to the status quo, um, there would be an enforcement deterrent, some form of legal or military deterrent consequence. But now we're seeing increasingly the enforcers of the consequences also not playing by their own rules. And so, when you see the Board of Peace convening to speak about Gaza, there are. I heard an African world leader who said, "Look, this doesn't replace the United Nations, but maybe this is the shock that it takes to get the sleeping giant to actually wake up and pay attention." Uh, and so, ultimately, I think about, the League of Nations didn't implode uh, before World War II. It just kind of fizzled out. So there was never a moment in the interwar period where people realized, oh, multilateralism is failing. It just kind of stopped mattering. It didn't have teeth. People didn't give it the credence that it mattered. And I really worry that we're seeing a similar trajectory with the United Nations, and certainly the significant withdrawal of funding through a lot of the programs by the US and others. And the fact that ultimately the Security Council just can't really do anything because of the veto powers. So, um, I guess at that strategic level, I think the word rupture is correct because I can't quite imagine how it's going to be sewn back together in short order.
Now, does that mean for New Zealand it provides a big issue? Because one, being the distance that we are from the rest of the world, perhaps has less, I guess, security benefits, but also we have less influence because it's less around that soft power and global world order, and more around perhaps enforcing at the moment, and so we're really sort of slightly removed from the action that some of our allies are taking. Or do you see this as a situation where New Zealand could take advantage of it because of where we sit, and actually we're less affected by some of what's going on, despite there are things like obviously it's now costing $3.40 to fill up a liter for diesel, which is bad for a country like us, reliant on those sorts of things. But from a general security point of view, perhaps it's doesn't really change things as much as it does for other people closer to where the conflicts are happening.
Yeah, I think it like our geographic distance used to be perceived as a strategic benefit. I think this definitely changes things for us, but it's not a sort of simple yes, we have a structural advantage or don't because of our geography. I think it's like it's part asset and part liability, but the um, both of those poles of the relationship are becoming more pronounced. So, historically being surrounded by a huge ocean moat, did provide real protection. We are far from many military threats, or maybe not directly involved in sort of direct sanctions and economic. I think we're going to maybe talk an outline about the weaponisation of trade. That's not really like directly impacting us. But traditionally, we would view that any hostile actor would have to project power over a very long way into a region where Australia and friendly states are quite present still. That protective logic is much weaker than it used to be because we live in an age of cyber attacks, economic coercion, disinformation, the spread of violent extremist ideologies online, foreign interference, long range strike systems, space disruption, right? Like I can go all day on this long list. All of those things compress that distance quite dramatically. And as you kind of pointed out, our remoteness creates new vulnerabilities or heightened vulnerabilities. So, we're so highly dependent on long sea lines of communication, subsea internet cables, imported inputs for our productive industries, and then we've got to get our goods to far off export markets. So, yeah, in a crisis, those dependencies can be shaped or disrupted by events that we've got very little ability to influence. And we're really seeing that playing out now with energy shortages. Um, there is still upside though, like we are further from most immediate conflict zones, terrorism hubs, the regional spillover effects that a lot of other countries are exposed to. But I guess the trade offs that when disruption comes, our ports aren't on the way to anything. So yeah, I think we need to maybe think more now about how we maximize what geographical advantages we do have, but more importantly, mitigate the key vulnerabilities that come from our place in the world.
As a really good way of narrowing in on what you just said is we have to trust Singapore to send us some refined petrol because we're not on the way to the US, and so the likelihood, if as things get more scarce, that becomes less and less, and so we need other ways to be self-sustainable around fuel, maybe more strategic reserves or something like that. Is that the kind of thing you're talking about? Because that's what I was thinking about over the weekend,
Yeah, look,
coincidentally.
yeah. Look, I think there's sort of three or four things that come to the front of my mind. That'll be a longer list, but buffers, because we just we've relied on this exquisite, efficient, just in time, relatively stable logistics system that has been largely like, with the exception of a tanker getting stuck in the Suez Canal or an extreme weather event, it's been really stable. So our business models run and are configured around those levels of efficiency. That's just not reliable anymore and won't be for the foreseeable future. So bigger buffers, fuel, medicine. Uh, uh, this is approximate, but I think something like 80% of the world's antibiotics are produced in China. So in any case, we have a high concentration of supply dependency for anything that can be problematic. But other critical inputs and key industrial supplies, like people probably don't realize, you think, well, we live on a big farm at the bottom of the world, so long as the cows are eating grass, we're kind of going to get by okay. But our fertilizer stocks come out of the Middle East and Africa. Um, certainly our like synthetic nitrogen, our urea is a byproduct of the petroleum process. So, sulfur is a key input for fertilizer. So, just to maintain a simple farm and keep getting our at the bottom end of the food chain goods going offshore actually relies on what happens in other parts of the world. So we're really sensitive to those connections. I'd also, want us to think about hardening connected infrastructure. So certainly our ports, shipping access, subsea cables, cyber defenses. You know, the rates of technology increase so fast that they become vulnerable to new threats every day. And there's just so much of them that also need to be, physically surveilled and protected potentially from interference. I really worry about our ports. They're vulnerable just to a weather event, let alone our inland, roading networks. One slip can shut down our main arterial routes for all of our trucking and essential services. So, yeah, and then you talk about diversifying markets and suppliers. Insofar as that's commercially viable, there's some considerations around that. And then certainly, investing in our military, diplomatic, and scientific connections in places like Antarctica and the Southwest Pacific, because a moat's only useful if it actually provides you sufficient early warning of an impending challenge. And you're certainly better off to face a more challenging world with as many friends as possible.
A lot of good stuff in there. And I think, the things sort of goes back to that original point you made about assumptions that everyone's based on. And the assumption is New Zealand, that I think, at least as a ordinary citizen, that we're really far away from things. So, she'll be right. But perhaps, a lot more, there is obviously a heck of a lot more that needs to be taken care of and thought through. I would love to hear about your take on what's going on in the Middle East. But before we launch into that, would you mind sharing how your time at the Pentagon, what did you learn about it as an organization? Because it is uh, so impactful in a whole range of ways. And then also how you think they have changed their strategic mindset over the last 20, 30 years, pre the current administration, because my understanding as an organization, it's evolved a fair amount.
Mm. Mm. Yeah, I mean, I guess at a high level, my experience with the Pentagon was fantastic. I just met some amazing people. They are incredibly welcoming and accommodating. So I got shown all around, got taken back to everyone's home state. The American hospitality is still alive and well despite everything you see on TV. Um, if I had to kind of sum it up in a word, it would be scale. So there's something like 26,000 people just in the Pentagon, which is their Department of Defense headquarters. I think it's the DoD's something like 2.1 million, it might even be closer to 2.9. So like half the size of New Zealand. So just an eye-watering scale. And so 26,000 actually, that's about half the size again, twice the size of the New Zealand Defence Force's uniformed headcount across Army, Navy, and Air Force, just in their headquarters. And so, how's that many people? They've got about. They do these tours where they rattle off all these facts, and I'd always nerd out on them. But I think they've got about 28 kilometres of corridors, and I figured if you laid those end to end, that would be like Wellington Airport to Porirua of corridors. So there's always sort of like the new person joke is someone would tell you to go to office A33E11 Charlie and then wait for you to get catastrophically lost and then try to find cell connections so someone can rescue you. Um, but
Power.
yeah, it's almost like its own small town. So like it's got its own shops, its own train station, food outlets. And my favorite anecdote from that is that the food court sells, I think, about 6,000 footlongs a day, the subway there. So like 2 kilometers or just shy of 2 kilometers a sandwich. So it's a pretty hungry machine. Probably went up by another kilometer while I was there. Yeah, so now look, there was also, I shouldn't jest too much. There is actually a very somber and focused register or tone to the building. Like you can still walk to the segment and see the new and the old paint lines from the renovations where the aircraft hit on 9/11. And that 28 kilometers of corridor, they're all lined with displays of the DoD's history. So it's almost like a museum, and it's like constantly reminding its people and telling the institution's story back to itself in that sort of uniquely American way. So it's quite a profound experience to be a part of. It's like it's got that McDonald's industrial scale quality, and there's the levity that comes with the things that make a massive bureaucracy feel a little bit silly sometimes, but equally really incredible people on a mission who see the world the way they do because of their experiences, which I think maybe Kiwis we sometimes sort of don't forget, but maybe don't quite understand why it so profoundly affects their behaviour and value set. I think what was the second part of that question was about how their thinking's changed.
That's right. Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
the size and scale of it, I mean, in terms of people, but also their influence around the world has evolved, and so especially since 9/11, and and yeah, I'd love to get your take on it because I'm sure it
Mm.
infuses operating within that organization.
Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah, look, I mean, I think to understand the way their thinking has changed over the last 20 years, you almost kind of have to go back a bit further into the 90s. So after the Berlin Wall fell and the Soviet Union collapsed, there was a strong sense across much of the West that I guess history had sort of finally and irrevocably tilted in our favour. And there was this idea or this expectation of the idea of a peace dividend. So uh, lower defence spending, much less emphasis on hard power, in favour of greater confidence that multilateral institutions, trade, globalisation, and rules-based integration would produce a more stable world. And yeah, that led to a real disinvestment in defence and national security capability in many countries, including the US. But maybe more importantly, like a little bit of an intellectual disarmament. A lot of people came to see hard-edged strategic competition as something that belonged to the past. And I'd argue that our broader strategic acumen, I say our, I'm sort of talking as a community here, um, maybe across the Five Eyes or those traditional allies and partners. I think our strategic acumen started to degrade from that point on. So, I just think about the number of strategy documents produced in all our capitals, the number of people with strategic in their job description. Then you contrast that against the number of people who can actually differentiate between a strategy, a plan, or a vision statement, and the number of documents that would actually meet the threshold of being good strategy. Yeah, it's quite concerning. Um, Part of that journey was 9/11, which you alluded to. It pulls us into the global war on terror. And, while we started getting really interested in national security again, we got much more focused on non-straight threats, counterterrorism, counterinsurgency, and immediate tactical issues that come with those problem sets rather than strategy per se. And Sun Tzu kind of alluded to this. I can't help it. Throw out a Sun Tzu quote every now and again.
Don't worry,
When
we
you
love them.
when you pursue tactics at the expense of strategy, you just get bogged down into unwinnable wars. Like even the name, the global war on terror, is problematic because terrorism is a tactic. So how do you go to war with a tactic? Like how do you know when it's been beaten? Um, I've always liked General Petraeus's famous quote back in Iraq in 2003. He goes, "Tell me how this ends." And I think we were still asking that question, almost 20 years later when we were withdrawing from Afghanistan. We just had a lack of good strategy. We were too unclear and tangled up. And then, what has changed probably more in the last 10 years is a return to strategic competition in the more traditional sense. That's really anchored around China's rise, but also reflected in Russian revisionism, Iranian, North Korean forays into, what we'd call the space between peace and war, the grey zone, where things like cyber and disinformation and interference can be deployed in ways that make it much harder to attribute, as well as major technological and supply chain rivalry. So that's forced governments to go back to a more classic view of strategy and to think about how all the elements of national power, diplomatic, informational, military, and economic, fit together again. I'm not sure that we're all quite there yet, but certainly for the US, that would probably represent the general arc of thinking over the last sort of 20 to 30 years.
Okay, and so how does that arc in influence what's going on in the Middle East today?
Yeah, that's interesting because sometimes you kind of wonder if the arc's done a 180 or if we're seeing a grand strategic design here. And I know analysts are having a fantastic time having that conversation at the moment. I, I think there probably is a higher level strategic concept in play. If you think about what was happening in the lead up to the Israeli-US attacks against Iran. They had the negotiating table with Russia trying to bring a ceasefire agreement with over Ukraine at the same time as they were trying to bring Iran to the table in Geneva to find a counter-proliferation and denuclearization agreement, which was never looking likely. The Iranian non-negotiables were just far too high. Um, but you then connect that to what happened in Venezuela recently. So we know that there's like a ghost fleet shipping network from between Venezuela and Iran, where they're switching hydrocarbons, petroleum products to support each other and evade sanctions. We know that that is fed back through Russia, so there's a line going that way, and anecdotally that there are strategic competitors of the US who are also benefiting from that illicit trade. So uh, it's hard to find the perfect causal relationship between the strategic choices, but there's something there that suggests Venezuela, Iran, Russia, and potentially China are linked. And you could say potentially because China is the significant beneficiary or buyer of Iranian energy. But China has a very resilient, um, national security posture, huge stockpiles, the ability to release reserves. So, you know, uh, it's a hard one. It's a really interesting one. I do think there's a linkage, but I sometimes think maybe we're looking at a miscalculation. All of the US's um, higher levels, or I guess you could call it grand strategy, for the past probably 10 years have said China's the pacing threat. We need to focus on the Indo Pacific. We need to move away from wars of choice. We need to not get bogged down in endless wars, particularly in the Middle East. And I know Trump's base certainly is highly supportive of that. So, I think that the choice to go into Iran, yeah, everyone always assumes they can have a quick war. Uh, Potentially not quite that simple, and this is now going to really put a lot of pressure on their ammunition stocks, uh, their military equipment availability, and their redundancy. If they're engaged in Eastern Europe militarily, even if it's through intelligence support, material, financial support to Ukraine, and then embroiled in a Middle Eastern conflict that will have economic consequences for their own voter base and national security or economic interests. And then something happens in the Indo Pacific. They're really you can't really fight at that level on three fronts. So yeah, it's an interesting time. It's a little bit hard to get your head into, but I think in some ways the Trump White House enjoys being strategically unpredictable.
On that I was about to ask the question exactly what you just said then, which is if the Pentagon is strategic in nature and and there's a lot of development of that strategic thought in amongst the 28 kilometers of corridors, and then and then the Trump administration does something potentially, because I don't know, maybe everybody was all aligned, but I'm assuming a little bit off what would be expected from the Pentagon. What actually happens on the ground? Does the Pentagon just move more tactically and go, okay, well, this is what's happening now, so we need to work out what to do, or and do they help with the situation on the ground, or what I don't understand, I guess, from a really simplistic basis is like you when you talk to some of these Americans working in the Pentagon and their armed forces and things, these are smart people, and it's not like they're totally unaware of the situation that's now playing out in Iran and perhaps some of the 180 turns, if that is the case, done by the administration. And so, what is the reaction function? Is everybody, you have to be loyal to your president and all those good things, but is there a change in tack about what their jobs look like when we're going through things like this?
Hmm. You had guessed, I don't know if it was the last one before, but there was an ex-American service person who came on and spoke, and I think he really nailed it when he said, um, it's the role of the military within a strong democracy to always defer to civilian control of the military. And so there's this idea in civil military relations that you provide best military advice. So that means you've got to be fully willing to speak truth to power and to point out where there are strategic risks. Um, but ultimately, you provide the best array of strategic options that you feel are a viable way of meeting the commander in chief's intent. Uh, he will take those under consideration and also take advice from his other advisors and departments. And ultimately, the decision that is made is the decision that needs to be executed up until a point at which it calls for a breach of the rules of armed conflict. Um, so, does it change the way they feel? I couldn't speak to, I guess, political, moral, or ethical alignment. It'll probably vary across the building, but ultimately, the job is you swore an oath under the Constitution, you serve your country, the people have democratically elected a leader, and the Constitution requires you to follow through with the orders based on the advice you've given.
And then what? And I guess does that mean that they will then change the way that they're operating in the sense of, okay, well, we were focused so much on, as you say, the threat of China. You speak to a lot of corporates, and corporates have to think about the geopolitics because of global trade and that sort of thing, and so everybody's sort of focused on China. And then in the famous Kiwi terminology, neck minute, we're sort of back in the Middle East. And
Yeah.
does that change the whole nature of or what they're analyzing? I guess, can these organizations, I guess the question is, can they be as nimble as that and go, okay, well, we're back in the Middle East. This is now where we have to focus. I guess there's a certain part of them that have to, but just interested in because this is quite a big change. It feels, especially from I guess Obama was all about Indo-Pacific. Biden, I'm not sure what he was up to, but Trump is certainly was that until he's now moved sort of back to the Middle East sort of laterally. And it's just an interesting dynamic of the use of resources and what they're doing and how you think about where the threats come.
Yeah, I mean, look, they can walk and chew gum at the same time. The way their military is organized is around global combatant commands, which is um, kind of sounds like something out of Star Wars. But if you imagine regional lines around maps, so they'll have Indo-PACOM headquartered out of Hawaii that's still firmly focused on the situation in, let's say, the South China Sea, Taiwan Strait. So they'll remain laser focused on that, and certainly maintaining good partnerships and relationships throughout the rest of Southeast Asia and the Southwest Pacific. Um, CENTCOM, Central Command Com, will be primarily focused on this issue with Iran, and then just above them, EUCOM, Europe Command, will maintain their eyes on Russia. So you still have, and then there's Northcom and Southcom over the Americas as well. So, and then, sorry, they've got all other comms. They've got Stratcom, which is kind of looking at nuclear strategic deterrence and developments there. Spacecom, looking further up. So they've got a way of sort of dividing and focusing their prioritization and effort. It will, though, drag on bandwidth on Capitol Hill. So that connective line between the Joint Chiefs of Staff and Capitol Hill just naturally gets a bit more congested with the immediate operational imperatives and decisions that need to be made. If they were planning and hoping for a rapid surgical strike, um, degrading military facility, missile installations, nuclear enrichment facilities, and a little bit of a decapitation of the Iranian leadership. They could have said, well, maybe it's a calculated risk. We'll be in and out in 6 weeks, and any bump on fuel prices are sustainable. We can absorb that and carry on. But as we've found out time and time again, I think MacArthur famously said during the Korean War that you'll be home by Christmas, and I think Kaiser Wilhelm said something similar around World War One, where it was like, by the time the leaves hit the ground for autumn, we'll be victorious. Um, Russia expected a short, decisive regime change outcome from its special military operation in Ukraine. Years later, we're still sort of bogged down and grinding away. So we always have this sort of optimism bias around the ability to have a quick war, to be short and decisive and technologically overwhelming. But it very, very seldom actually eventuates. So, coming back to the original question, I think at the highest levels of decision making now, there'll be much more focus on the Middle East.
This is a slightly rhetorical question. I'm going to put it out anyway. Why, Trump is mercurial by nature and obviously uses it as a strategy sort of tactic, but why can he not just stop?
Um, I actually think he can, and up until about a week ago, I thought that was probably the most likely off ramp. That he sort of says, "Well, we've achieved sufficient, or we had limited strategic objectives. We've achieved them, so we've inflicted sufficient damage, and the next move is to declare mission success and try to move back, get energy flowing again." Um, it's still a plausible off ramp. It gives Trump the basis to say that the operation worked. American strength restored deterrence, and that now it's time to step back from further escalation. I think the issue is that can you actually get return to normal energy flows? I mean, for one, let's just say everyone stops shooting tomorrow. Your risk, your insurance premium is still going to be elevated because it's a recent war zone. There's been talk of mining, and you've still got a highly ideologically motivated group on one side, and the state's looking quite weak. So, how much control is realistic. So, insurance would be higher. Those first shipping companies who are brave enough to take the financial and reputational risk of trying it, certainly the freight rates would be higher. And there's been a lot of damage to energy production across the region. It's going to take some time to get back up online. While we've got heightened demand and constrained supply, you can see elevated prices. So, it's probably not just quite as simple as saying, well, we'll just have a ceasefire or end the war and then we can get back to it. I think the White House's advisors will probably be making that quite clear. And then, I mean, there are other potential off ramps, but you always have this sort of sticking point here where they assume that the Iranian regime would just be willing at some point to ease off as well. But so far, Tehran's been operating on a strategy of imposing maximum cost and trying to restore deterrence, which is kind of a classic defender strategy, similar to what the Taliban and Ukraine have employed. And recent commentary coming out of Iranian officials have been quite open that they want to respond in a way that makes sure the US and Israel never tries this again. So I think they sense a relative point of advantage or leverage around the control of shipping flows through the Strait. They've indicated just in the last few days that they'd only agree to a ceasefire if there was a really steep price for Washington and the Gulf states. I think some of their latest conditions were like massive reparations from the US and its allies, and the expulsion of all military forces from the region. They've also called for transforming the Strait of Hormuz, which is currently an international waterway, so free for navigation, guaranteed under international law. They want to turn it into an Iranian toll booth. So ultimately, you pay us for the privilege of moving 1/3 of the world's shipborne crude oil past us. So you can hear this really bullish tone in these demands. And that's kind of reflected in the foreign minister just over the weekend was talking about this as another Vietnam for the US. So that tells me they actually believe they're winning the defender's imperative. And they just need to win the balance of time and come back stronger. Um, and some in mainstream media have sort of said, well, that's laughable and never going to happen. But it's worth remembering that Iran's got a long track record of doing this, like sticking to unrealistically rigid policies. Um, Back in the Iran-Iraq war, Iran, who was invaded by Hussein, they'd actually reclaimed all of their territory by 1982, but they only agreed to a ceasefire in 1988 after years of continued destruction and hundreds of thousands of casualties. So it's not just the case that if Israel and the US stop striking, that Iran would too. And I think the last point here is that even if restraint did look strategically logical from Tehran, it can't just make that decision neatly or quickly because it's not a simple system where one person or a cabinet makes a call and then the rest of the state kind of falls in behind them. Iran has revolutionary leadership sitting alongside formal state institutions. So yes, it has a president and a parliament, but real power sits across a much broader regime structure with the supreme leader at the top. And then you've got your conventional military, but you've also got the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps sitting alongside it. who are sort of sacredly charged to be a core protector of the regime. So, you know, a lot of parts of the state that are most tied to regime survival are really highly ideologically driven. So it's not just about what looks strategically rational, but what's politically and ideologically acceptable for a regime that's, you know, it's facing the biggest challenge to its survival from both from outside and from within since it was founded. So any move to de-escalation, it has to be supportable across those different power centers. And I guess the bottom line is that they can't make any decision that makes the regime look weak or humiliated.
It's interesting, isn't it? You know, pre the war, one would already think that there was a lot of dislike to walk towards America and Israel from Iran, and that, you know, attitudinally, it perhaps you'd already reached peak disdain, call it that. So this, in some levels, doesn't change anything, but I suspect it probably really sharpens their focus, whatever path it goes from here on in. Um, New Zealand and or actually before we launch into that, how do you, you know, if you were to allocate probabilities in terms of path from here and likelihood of, say, boots on the ground at one end and then other paths forward, where is your current thinking?
Well, Mike Hosking said 3 weeks this morning, so I'm sure, you know, his strategic brain is gospel. So
From when, I would say.
Yeah, look, we're kind of talking about escalators, and you're right to call me on probability, even though you know any analyst hates being put on the spot with that. But
As best as you feel you can. Obviously, there's so many uncertainties, right?
yeah,
And that it's hard to. But you know, even if you can't ascribe probabilities, what are the natural sort of paths from here, from the lens that you possess? Because we obviously look at it from an economic standpoint
mm,
more than we do from a military one, and we have no understanding of how, at the same level you do, of how, you know, America is likely to go through the process of decision making at a military level.
yeah. Look, I think so. One of the things that I think caught a lot of people out with this war, because people thought that the US strike group sitting off in the Indian Ocean was about a bit of saber rattling to maybe coerce people to come to a diplomatic resolution in Geneva. No one was looking at the Israelis. And so sometimes it's better to think about the other actors in play. The US will have its own decision calculus and it's important, but I'm quite concerned about so just the recent escalation where we're targeting both Iranian and Gulf energy facilities. So, like, Iraq's a really good example here. Um, Oil accounts for about 60% of their GDP. Um, and I think that's 90%. I was talking about this with someone the other day, about 90% of their government revenue overall. So, and they rely on Iranian natural gas for their own energy, particularly through winter. So this is a state that's only, you know, just kind of come out of the ISIS period or years of tenuous stability kind of settling now. If it's exposed to um, challenges to its credibility, its core infrastructure, its economic processes, you know, it's really likely for it to become destabilized again. You can see heightened militia threats, institutional fragility, legitimate issues there. So the connection between natural gas dependence from Iraq to Iran, who don't like each other but have a bit of a frenemy thing going on, can have a real flow-on effect into the rest of the region. If Iraq's losing oil revenue and struggling with energy supply because Iranian gas and electricity flows are being disrupted, then that can create a new weak state or power vacuum dynamic again next door. And you bear in mind that Afghanistan and Pakistan are fighting along their border just to the east of Iran. You know, we've got Israel on a ground offensive in Hezbollah. We've got the Houthis lobbing missiles into the Red Sea on the other side. So this can really quickly turn into an issue that affects broader energy producing states. Um, the choices that the US make are important. I think they're going to look for the fastest way out. I think they'll want to put some controls on Israel. You can see a little bit of a mismatch at the moment where Tel Aviv potentially has more advanced strategic objectives than the US. They're probably, I mean, they see Iran as an existential threat. And so they'd be far more interested in, potentially up to regime change. I think the US wouldn't want to go there. They wouldn't want to get drawn in with boots on the ground, but it could get to the point where actually to get shipping moving freely again, they might have to, just to put enough of a buffer back off the coast so that they've got more time to conduct interception for a naval escort. Um, so, look, if I had to say it today, and I have a new assessment every week once new information comes through, but at the moment, I can't see this settling before the end of April. And I think you'll see a bow wave of raised prices and certainly a big economic flow on effect probably through until Christmas. That's assuming we don't have a really significant escalation that could come through, like a mass casualty event, if Iran manages to get a really good hit on a US or coalition military installation throughout the region. Um, if Israel or a proxy like the displaced Iranian Kurds up in northern Iraq decide to come down and make a gumball rally on Tehran. If we see border and customs institutions kind of collapsing on the borders, then everything that's happening in Pakistan, Afghanistan, potentially Iraq, it all changes the calculus for how this could play out. So I think we should be currently focused on how we bed in and build resilience and absorb shocks probably for the rest of the year.
Which was actually, that is like the most perfect alley-oop for my next question, which was, in New Zealand, we don't typically put national security as a large election issue, and certainly not over recent years or elections. Is this going to shift the dynamic there, do you think? And is this conversation going to be the central issue, or is it going to continue to be the more traditional ones?
Yeah. I think, like people are seeing the connection between what happens overseas and how it affects national security. Um, my concern is that, the media typically gets interested in something within at most about a 3-month cycle, and then we start getting tired of it. And the next thing comes along. It won't institutionally take root easily without quite a concerted effort, probably from central government or maybe a civil push. But, you know, the, I think it's partly because of the geography we spoke about earlier. Like our place in the world shapes our culture and our political instincts. And because we live so far from these major conflict zones over generations, that has influenced not just how we live, but how we think and what we worry about. We've also been, spared many of the sort of defining national traumas that typically sharpen security conversations in other countries. So we haven't had our own Pearl Harbor, the Battle of Britain, a bombing of Darwin, a 9/11, and you'll notice that those electorates tend to engage more seriously with national security because they've had a personal experience with it. In much the same way that perhaps most Kiwis would have a strong opinion or preference around health or education policy because they've probably had a tangible experience with it themselves. But we've grown up in a country that's always felt relatively safe and stable and remote, and so we share a public mental model about the world that's been shaped more by that peace and liberalism and open trade than by a lived sense, I guess, of strategic peril. Um, and that probably was reinforced by the generations who came of age politically in the latter half of the 20th century. For them, the big defining events weren't traditional military threats like our grandparents or great grandparents would have been concerned about. They were more like, standout moral and political moments. So, seeing Vietnam on TV, the decolonization movement, anti-apartheid activism, the Rainbow Warrior, Springbok Tour, the Hanses rupture, these were generationally defining moments in our societal culture and value set. And then they were kind of reinforced because with the end of the Cold War and that relatively peaceful, 90s, what's been described as a holiday from history, probably felt like compelling proof of that new way of seeing and organizing the world for better. But when a country builds its assumptions and values around that kind of world, those beliefs tend to ossify and get really difficult to challenge. They get passed through your institutions, your politics, and your families, and they keep shaping how people interpret events. which I think we're still seeing with what's happening overseas. That keeps flowing into political incentives today. So because our voters are mostly focused on the cost of living, the economy, housing, health, and education, political parties will concentrate on those issues. They'll typically recruit candidates and build policy capability and fight and win elections where that electoral return's highest. But the same incentives just aren't there with defence and national security. Like in relative terms, those portfolios sit fairly low in our political hierarchy. So like in Australia, I think it's the deputy prime minister is the defence minister. Um, it's also quite common to see parties having like very thin policy around national security, like if any, or policy that's sometimes more just moral positioning than like a serious theory of national security success. So we still, despite what we're seeing, do now and probably will lack the kind of robust public debate that we need. Like a genuine marketplace of ideas around alternative strategies, a transparent understanding of risk and trade-offs, uh, a robust scrutiny of the assumptions that our policies are built on. And I think defensible logical foundations based on how the world is versus more normative positions about how we want the world to be.
Tim, I
So
think that description is probably the best description of the political environment, whatever side you sit on. I've heard in a very long time, and it's not just defense and security. I think you could probably do it to the retirement savings, pensions, health, education. All these things is what worked in the past. Is what we should do in the future, and no willingness to have an actual strategic debate and put sort of your political stripes to one side and actually talk about it in a logical way. That I kind of want to kind of record that. Or we are recording it. Like go, this is my view now. This is exactly how I think, because I think that's exactly right.
The future health minister, Tim Ewing-Jarvie. Yes.
please,
Is there a country that does it well? Like, is it someone that we can role model off and say, hey, Nordic countries or Singapore or something, where we go, this is a country,
Or if we had $1 trillion of oil in the
Yeah.
ground that we could export, would probably be doing pretty
sure.
well as well.
and
Yeah.
fishing, let's just forget. Yeah.
I mean, like, yes, but for different reasons. So I don't think any one model would be a perfect fit for us. But like Finland's probably a standout for, they talk about whole of society resilience. So they've got this comprehensive security model that explicitly ties together government, business, communities, and citizens. And so the core idea isn't just defense, it's like continuity of vital functions across society in all conditions. Singapore, as you mentioned, they're really strong on state capacity, their planning discipline. They do this total defense thinking, which is sort of unique to their culture, their experience, and their geography. But they're unusually serious about linking their economic resilience and social cohesion to their civil readiness and security. And I think there's a really valuable lesson there for us. But their political culture is very different to ours. So what I'd say at that is like, yeah, they're a great example of a small state that treats resilience as like a national operating system rather than just a niche policy area, which is I think how we talk about it. Estonia is really good on digital and cyber resilience, and I think Switzerland, I think they've recently ranked first in a global resilience index, which is sort of looking at geopolitical, economic, and climate risks. So, but there's plenty of good examples, but I think the right option for New Zealand has to be linked to our unique strategic theory of success. Really clear dimensions around what's in our national interest. And like I've said a couple of times, like a really sober and transparent account of the trade-offs that we're willing to make or not, because those really strike at the heart of your national values and they have to come with social license. So it might be part of the reason why it's so hard to legislate or regulate resilience from central government, because we just don't have the necessary conversation going to really enable that kind of bold action.
Okay. Well, I think we'll leave it there, Tim. That was from, I think it's fair to say on behalf of James, other than using Nick Minute in a Monday call for the first time ever, one of the best conversations we've ever had on this sort of topic. And I really, really appreciate your time. It was hugely enlightening. and obviously you've got some personal experience, plus you've thought really, really deeply about all the different factors.
Yeah, I mean, it's heartening to see someone working back in New Zealand with that experience, trying to influence this thought process in our country, and it's great to see. We need a lot more of you.
Thanks, gents. It's been a real pleasure, and I'm a big fan of the call, so I'm looking forward to seeing what you do next.
Brilliant.
Thanks, Tim.
Thanks, Tim.
Cheers.
Have a great week.
Cheers.
New Zealand Funds Management Limited is the issuer of the NZ Funds Active Income Series, NZ Funds Active Inflation Series and NZ Funds Active Growth Series, together the NZ Funds Active Series, as well as the NZ Funds KiwiSaver Scheme, the NZ Funds Managed Superannuation Service, NZ Funds Wealth Builder and NZ Funds Income Generator. For further information or to request a copy of the product disclosure statement for each of these, please contact NZ Funds or visit nzfunds.co.nz. This recording is provided for information purposes only. The information provided is not intended as a substitute for specific professional advice on investments, financial planning or any other matter. Past performance is not an indication of future returns.